Welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining Variety to talk about Defending Jacob, which obviously just came out with its series finale on Apple TV+. First of all, I want to preface for the audience, if you haven't seen it yet, we are going to dive into some pretty specific details. So please go watch it first and then come back and watch this. Right. But Chris, I am curious for the character perspective. Like Andy Barber is this guy who, was comfortable telling little lies throughout his marriage and his life. Mm-hmm. And kind of at the end there, it's a big one. Sure. With his grand jury and standing up for his wife and saying this is an accident when she drove the car into crashed the car. And I'm curious from your perspective, like, first and foremost, do you believe it was an accident? Did you need to believe it was an accident in order to play this guy who was
I think this? Andy has had a lifetime of experience of compartmentalizing his rationale in order to preserve a belief system. I think a lot of people who grow up with trauma in their past harness these coping mechanisms. They're capable of burying guilt and leaving things unexamined in order to survive. And as a result, Andy's had a lifetime of experience kind of separating that kind of swampy mess. And Laurie's character doesn't have those tools. And it's so strange because I'm so used to not being able to give spoilers, but go watch the show. I think as more information comes out and Laurie reconcile what she believes to be the truth with this idea of family, I think in order to prevent her from becoming a part of those lies, that's why that final act of hers was kind of a grasp at what she considered to be truth, real, and that meant more to her than this belief system or the identity of family, whereas Andy's identity is so tangled up in these monikers of father, of husband, of just normalcy, because again, he's coming from a really traumatic place. He's not willing to give it up. That's where that's where the road forward.
And it's interesting because obviously the show was shot in a time where the world looked very different than the world looks right now, but it's still dealing with the idea of like, what is justice for this kid that was killed, for this kid that was accused, for this family now that's been embroiled in this bigger tragedy. So I am curious from your perspective, both as an actor and as an executive producer on the project, what you felt like that ending says about the sense of justice that they all really have.
Sure. Well, I looked at it less from the perspective of whether or not the judicial system did their job and more about whether or not we as humans are able to compartmentalize what we need to do in order to kind of circumvent, the conventional notion of law. How far would you go to preserve your family, your son, your wife, your loved ones? And I think in that arena, law matters very little. You know what I mean? And I think, the prison you're kind of trying to avoid is a prison from within. And I know that feels a little pretentious, but it's kind of accurate. You know what I mean? I don't think Andy or Laurie are really worried about the law so much as what it means for their lives. As I said earlier, not to retrace lines, but both of their identities are so entangled in this concept of family, and it's been the foundation of an entire belief system, and to kind of lose that in such a short amount of time, I think is just too much for certain people to cope with, and I think that's where they're willing to bend sort of their moral North Star, and like I said, I think that's more of the interesting perspective than whether they're willing to break actual laws.
But it is interesting, I think, coming out when it is now, because obviously our sense of a moral North Star, I think I'll speak for the US, like it's a little skewed given the state of the world. Do you feel like this finale has more weight now because of what's happening and the things that we're seeing our leaders do or people in our lives do as they struggle with the new law?
Right. I see the nexus, but I don't know that, I think that would be a little bit of a reach for me to say that, that does have those layers. I think, if we were really trying to examine what is going on today, I think it could be done in a far better way than whatever. That's not what that show set out to explore. So I think it's, might be a bit too far to say that there's a connection there. listen, but that's the beauty of film. If you see something and it means something to you in a certain way, great. But I think it would feel disingenuous for me to say that was an intent.
Right. I mean, and to be fair, I mean, the book did come out years ago, even before the show, obviously. And so, I mean, the book, again, if viewers haven't read the book, this will be a little spoilery, but there was this sense in the book of, I think, a little bit more closure, because at the end, Jacob is no longer alive. Here in the show, Mark obviously changed that ending, and now this family, if and when this kid wakes up, has to deal with the consequences of everything. I mean, did you approach that? Was there a feeling around that ending as more or less tragic, do you feel like, than if he had died in this version?
I don't think I would weigh it on the scale of more or less tragic. I think I would weigh it on the scale of more or less interesting. I think one of the best aspects of film, from my perspective, is being able to dissect and do a post-mortem later on. And I think this ending leaves far more, obviously, ambiguity and room for discussion and varying perspectives. And I think that is, in my opinion, a sign of a really effective story.
So I want to go back a little bit, because, throughout the series, we're really seeing Jacob a lot through Andy's eyes. And, playing a father, stepping into that role, tell me if this is wrong, but Mark had mentioned to me that he thought you were channeling your own father a lot through the performance. And I'm curious if that's A, true, but B, also, what you felt like you learned from watching your father with you that helped with this, given that the situation is so much more extreme than I can imagine anything you went through as a child.
Sure. Yeah. Well, certainly from the physicality standpoint, I mean, my father wore a tie to work, and, just coffee in the morning, the way he held the paper, the way he, posturing and, leaning in doorways, just there was a very paternal physicality that I got to adopt that absolutely reminded me of my father. And I suppose, look, as we all get older and you start to see your parents as people, and maybe you learn a little bit about their experience when you were a child that you had no idea was going on. I certainly have had my eyes open in terms of how good my father was at not bleeding on us. The things that went on that I had no idea he was going through. And so that kind of internalized, taciturn approach to what would otherwise be a very dramatic circumstance was certainly borrowed from him.
I mean, the way that Andy is just so in his son's corner also, I think, speaks a lot about who he is, but I think also speaks a lot about, like, the capability for unconditional love that we have as people. Yeah. Do you feel like you learned anything about yourself and your own capabilities in that area through this role?
I've never been confused as to how I would react. I'll bury a body for my family. That's just the way I was raised, and that's just kind of my mentality. I would go above and beyond and do anything for them, as I think most people would. And like I said, Andy just happened to have more experience in that arena. I mean, I think that takes a very specific set of tools to kind of not necessarily muffle your morality, but you understand how to compartmentalize in order to sustain this other thing that you consider to be worth it. And like I said, Lori just can't reconcile this. She can't create, these two separate approaches.
I mean, and because he is doing that, I mean, there's so much of him that feels very internal, and feels like for you, it must be a lot of, like, quiet character work. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I had heard that for past roles, you had visited a therapist and kind of worked through some ideas or concerns that you had. And I'm curious if you had to do that with this, given the dramatic stakes. And if you didn't, basically, what did you have to do to kind of get in and out of the right headspace?
No, not for this one, luckily. That was more for just, turning a corner in my career in terms of participating in films that reach a much broader audience to a point that it can change your day-to-day life. So no, not in that regard, but I would say, this type of project, 20 years ago, it would have been a movie, and it just would have been all engine, and it wouldn't have had the same opportunity to let these moments breathe. And one of the nice pieces of this project is not only that the story is spaced out so moments can live, but I was a producer on it, and really that's just title, but it certainly does play a subconscious role in terms of the comfort you feel on set. You really do feel like it's almost your barbecue too. You're not just you're not just being invited. So it does kind of feel like it's acting in general is a playground where you go to take risks, and especially when you don't get to kind of flex those explorations through dialogue, whether it's just internal, and you just got to let your mind kind of run a little bit, and like I said, something about feeling like I'm throwing this party and not just being invited to it. You feel a certain sense of comfort and excitement about that risk, and willingness to kind of let things breathe. And again, like I said, this goes back to the medium itself, that it encourages that type of performance. And between Mark and Morton and everyone involved, I really came to set every day really eager to try and live in those silent moments and try and tell a story without saying too much.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you talk about, throwing the party, because to me that feels like there's more pressure on you. Obviously there's an expectation from the audience who does know the book. Maybe there's an expectation on audience who hears Apple, this new streamer, knows your past work, knows what the Marvel pressure, what were your expectations? Like what did that feel like? And how did you kind of balance what felt like a risk with a reward?
Sure. This could feel, the concept of expectations is a little bit of a fallacy and a little bit of a slippery slope. And I kind of got in those weeds 10 years ago, when I signed up for Captain America. And part of the last 10 years has been about awakening to the fact that it is a fallacy, and that the whole notion of things like momentum and perception and these things are really, you can create those burdens if you want them, but it's really got nothing to do with the work. So I've gotten a lot better over the years about compartmentalizing and recognizing that look, I'd be lying if I said you don't think about how it'll be received, but you certainly don't want to let the tail wag the dog and start to cut your cloth according to how you think it'll be received. So for the most part, during the shoot itself, very little thought spent on those types of things. Maybe afterwards, in a panicked retrospect, you say, "Oh my God, did I do enough? Are they going to hate this?" But while you're actually filming, again, with all the combined factors I mentioned earlier, going to set every day was a lovely, lovely, lovely place to do, what we do. I don't know, I kind of forgot that I was a producer half the time. You know what I mean? It's mostly been interviews like this where they ask me what I liked, and I'm like, oh yeah, I was a producer. So I don't know that it affected it too much, to be honest.
Okay.
I still approached, every day the same way.
Well, I mean, maybe this is not the right follow-up question, but given that this is a bigger step for your producing career, I am curious if you have more coming. Like if there's more, control might be the wrong word, but like if there are ways that you are looking to develop more and shape your own career in a different way.
It's a little bit of an unexplored arena for me. I know some actors, they're developing 2 movies to act in and 10 movies to produce and a couple things of writing and a TV show. And, that's never been my vibe. I do a movie and then I'm like, I need a break. I'm very mercurial by nature. So I don't know. I don't like having too many balls in the air. I like feeling very simple and streamlined in a lot of ways. So I don't know. I mean, this is a tough experience by which to measure, because like I said, it wasn't like I was putting out fires every day. It wasn't like I was steering the ship in some capacity. To be honest, my title as producer was probably only there in case the project began to spiral a little bit. If all of a sudden it began to derail, at least I had a voice to try and say, hey, let's get back to center. That never happened. You know what I mean? My only job every day ever felt like I have to say these lines and that's my job. So that's a real testament to Mark and Morton. It's a testament to Apple. It's a testament to the whole project. So I don't know. I mean, I think I'd be a fool to use this as the benchmark in terms of what it is to be a producer. So I guess I'm not quite sure. In a very serpentine, lengthy answer, I don't know.
Okay, it's fair enough. And you did mention a few seconds ago, and I want to go back to this, when we're talking about expectations and how it's a fallacy, but then you did say, sometimes when you then see it come out, there's maybe a different reaction. So I'm curious if you have watched this back, if you have been kind of paying attention to the reaction, like if you feel like your experience doing it is different with the hindsight of seeing it.
Yeah. No, this one is, I've been a part of plenty of projects where the reality doesn't quite meet the expectation. this was not the case. You know, from the very first piece of footage I saw, I loved the way Morton shot it. I love Mark's writing. Their passion shines through in every single frame. They both have kids roughly the same age as Jacob. So everything about this project was very satisfying. I didn't, not for a minute, felt like, oh, I think we missed the mark on this one. So I couldn't be happier with it.
Is there a piece of the story or a piece of his character arc that you felt like was particularly challenging, though, in the sense of wrapping your head around the performance or learning something about him later that you didn't expect?
Well, when you're playing a guy who, you know, you have to let the audience in. You have to let them in. As internal as you want to go, the nature of, I mean, I forget, I think it might have even been Julianne Moore. She said, you know, the audience doesn't come to see you. They come to see themselves. So you have to let them in. You have to let them see a piece of themselves. So the tricky thing about playing a guy who's so internalized is that you don't want to become cold. You don't want to become shut off. You still have to find, you know, you want the audience to lean forward to try and get inside, but then you have to let them in a little. So it's about finding those moments as to, you know, where you can, you know, strategically place those cracks to let people see the human side as opposed to this wall that he probably would want you to see.
And just looking at, I mean, obviously, you know, it's been billed the whole time as a limited series. The show runs the course of the book with changes. But do you feel like, given the changes, given the fact that at the end this family is all kind of left and will have to pick up the pieces, is there a world where you want to revisit this and see what that looks like for them? Or, you know, maybe not immediately, but 5 years down the road, what is their life?
It's a good question. I don't know. I really haven't even considered it, just because it is a piece of literature, and I never really considered that. I mean, put it this way. I loved working with Apple and Mark and Morton and Michelle and Jaden and JK and Cherry. I mean, the entire cast, crew, everyone top to bottom was thrilling. So if it meant, you know, getting the band back together in that capacity, I'd jump at it. In terms of the actual story that the Barbers could tell, I'm not quite sure. You know, like I said earlier, I'm pretty capricious. So what may sound good today may not tomorrow. But if strictly speaking about the people involved, I'd work with them all again in a heartbeat.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Really,
Please say hello to Dodger.
I will.
Big fan. And again, if you guys haven't watched Defending Jacob yet, I mean, you're spoiled now, but do it anyway. It's streaming on Apple TV Plus.
It's worth it. Thank you. Thank you so much.